Hey, welcome to a developer's guide to using Copilot in SSMS. My name is Erin Stellato. I'm a program manager at Microsoft, and specifically I'm the PM for both SSMS, one of the PMs for SSMS, as well as the PM for Copilot in SSMS. And I'm really excited to talk to you about Copilot today. And I want to level set with a couple thoughts that I keep in mind when I'm thinking about Copilot. The primary goal of Copilot in SSMS is to make your life simpler. How can we make you more efficient? Copilot's not going to replace you. It's not going to do your job. It is finding tiny bits of improvement throughout your day that in the end add up. Whether it's an hour a day, which becomes 5 hours a week, which becomes whatever you do the math, right? That is really what Copilot is about. So I'd love for you to kind of keep that premise, thought in mind as we go through this session. Now, we obviously are targeting specific folks with Copilot and SSMS, like database administrators. We want to help them troubleshoot, tune, do their database administration tasks, back up all of that faster, easier. And we also want to help developers, right? How do we help you write T-SQL, design objects, improve query performance through rewrites, understand what's going on with a query, why it might not be performing well. And then we also want to help the folks who maybe aren't senior DBAs or senior developers who fall more into that accidental DBA, involuntary DBA, developer, new to SQL. We want to help those folks as well. So Copilot is for anyone and everyone. We include everybody because we know that there are tons of folks who use SSMS, and I truly believe it can help you regardless of where you are in your journey. The great thing is that it knows nothing about you. It treats everybody the same, and it meets you exactly where you are based upon the questions that you ask of it. Now, there's a few principles that I want to talk about first. And if you've seen any session related to Copilots for Microsoft, you may find some of this information kind of familiar. So forgive me if that's the case. But one of the first principles for Copilot and SSMS, and one reason why I think that it's so good, like quite frankly, is that the responses are grounded in your connection. So we understand that you're connected to a particular flavor or version. A flavor is the word that I tend to use, or offering, right, for SQL Server, whether that's Azure SQL Database, whether that's Azure Managed Instance, whether that's a particular release of SQL Server. Those are all database engines that we support. And the powerful thing here is that when you're connected, we understand what you're connected to, and we understand information about your database. So when I say that your responses are grounded in that database environment, that's really what I mean. We have this connection and database context that we leverage when you're submitting your prompts. And then it's really important to be clear that Copilot only has access to what you can do. It can only do what you can do. So if you ask it to write a statement to drop a database and you say, run this query, if you don't have permissions to drop the database, then Copilot can't drop the database for you. There's no way for it to circumvent the permissions that you have based upon your login, right? We're respecting those that have been assigned to you. And then the last thing that's really, really important, and this relates to privacy, and I cannot be clear enough in some ways about this, is that your data is your data, and we have no interest in retaining, using it in any way, shape, or form. So to be explicit, the prompts that you submit, the responses that get sent back, any metadata queries that we're running, again, to understand that context, we're not keeping any of that. We're not retaining it. We're not storing it. We are not using it to train or retrain an existing model or a new model. Your data is yours. I used to be a consultant. I don't want to see your data. I just want to help you. So I hope that is how you think of Copilot and SSMS. This will be very clearly documented. But again, we're not keeping that. We're not using that data in any way. The architecture for Copilot in SSMS is a RAG-based semantic kernel implementation. So what that means is RAG, if you're not familiar with that, response augmented. So we are running metadata queries behind the scene based upon whatever prompt you've submitted, and then taking that information and wrapping it around the prompt and sending that over to the model so that we can get a curated response, a response that's specific to the version of SQL you're connected to, your database, the objects in your database. So when we're talking about the grounded, right, meaning we're leveraging that connection and information about your database with this RAG-based implementation to give you a really good response within Copilot and SSMS. And then the architecture is a bring your own endpoint. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but right now, as it stands, we support endpoints in Azure OpenAI. And right now, Copilot and SSMS is in a private preview, so please don't go looking for it in SSMS 21 or an earlier version of SSMS 20. It is only available through private preview. You have to be signed up for that. And again, right now, the architecture limits you to an endpoint that exists in Azure OpenAI. And then the cost for Copilot is going to be dependent upon the endpoint, the deployment that you have, the model that you choose, and then the volume of use. What types of questions are you asking? Not types of questions really, but kind of how big is that prompt and how much are you sending across? It's related to the tokens. Now, the endpoint model that I mentioned, Copilot and SSMS is going to be, or is being, tested and tuned against the GPT-4o model. The thing with Azure OpenAI is that you can select whatever model you want. The thing is that the responses may vary if you select something other than the GPT-4o, because that's the one that we're working against. We need something that's consistent, and therefore that's the model that we're going to recommend. Eventually, we would love to have, or we're planning, I look forward to when this happens, but we're planning to support small language models. Or the ones that you might develop internally. So for air-gapped customers, air-gapped cloud customers, for those of you who don't feel comfortable connecting to a model out on the internet, ideally in the future here, I don't have a timeline as to when, we're going to support those small language or in-house models that you may have. And that's probably enough of slides, right? Let's go to a demo. So we're going to go ahead and start here within SSMS, and we're in SSMS 21, actually, and you'll see that the Copilot is a pane. If you're familiar with Object Explorer, Template Explorer, those are panes. They can be dragged around, even put on a separate monitor, which isn't going to happen here. And then you can pin and unpin that sidecar chat. So I'll often say the sidecar chat. And we're going to start with what I would think maybe is a regular kind of development task, which is I need to create a database. We're going to call ours General Hospital. Props to you if you get that reference. And we're saying I want to create this with a couple data files because my DBA said that was what I needed to do, and they needed to be pre-sized. So it gives me back this script, which is, okay, here you go. Here's your 2 data files and your log file. And we've set them, the pre-size to 100 megs, and it says review and adjust the file paths and sizes. So it's not just giving me the script, but it's also giving me some helpful information. And in this case, I'm like, oh, you know what? I actually need to put this database in the C databases General Hospital folder. So rather than update the script myself, I'm just going to ask Copilot to do it. This is that little bit of efficiency, right, that we're asking for here. Like, don't do the extra work. Ask Copilot to do that. Really quickly here, it gave me 3 data files. I said, no, I only want 2. So I went back and asked it to change that, and it did. Now I've created that database, and now what we're doing is I'm going to say, okay, we're designing this database for this hospital. They're similar to any hospital in that we have to track patient info, doctor info, appointments, diagnosis, test results. Suggest some tables for me, and it's going to browse a website and display information. Make sure my tables have a clustered index and a primary key. And it spits all of that out for me. So it lists every table that we have here that I asked for, patients, diagnoses, doctors, test results. And every single one of those has a clustered index on it. It also put foreign keys on there. I haven't zoomed in on that, but it gave me each of these as a separate script, and I'm like, I don't like that. Can you put all of those in one giant script? And so it's basically going to be like, sure, I'll do that for you. It's going to go grab all of those and put them into one script that I can then copy and paste. Now, I'm going to point out a couple things here. This is why you are still very important, right? Copilot is an assistant. It's here to help you. But it's making some guesses about your data and the data types, and you're going to definitely want to validate that. Maybe these are not all of the columns that you want. Maybe you want a few more. Maybe last name should be 100 instead of 50 for an NVAR car, right? People have longer last names. So this is really to get you started and saves you a ton of time from having to go figure out your create table statements. But in the end, it is your decision, right? What to keep, what to not keep, modify, etc. So I'm just doing a little bit of that here. And I'll also call out here that right now, this implementation is the sidecar chat where the script displays, and then I have to copy it over to the editor. Some of you are like, hey, that's not at all like what I've seen in GitHub Copilot. I get it. We are working on an inline editor. So multiple phases of development here. Phase 1, I'm sure you all are familiar with that, right, as developers. Phase 1 was, hey, let's get the sidecar working. Next phase is, okay, we're going to go ahead and make that inline editor available. Now I zoomed in here on master, and I want you to note that I'm changing the database connection to the general hospital database that I just created, because I want to create these tables in that general hospital database, not in master. Raise your hand if you've accidentally done that. Now that I've changed connection, Copilot actually does a reset there to note that the connection has changed. Remember, this context is important here. And so my next question is, how am I going to view these tables in my database? And it comes back with some information. It gives me a query that I can run to see these queries in my database. So we'll go ahead here and copy that. And again, this copy and paste, I understand it's a two-step process right now. This is something that we're going to make improvements to. But think about here what we're asking Copilot to do and how this is saving us time. So I have a query here that goes against systables and schemas so I can see the tables that were created. Now I want to generate some data because I want to write some queries, and it's nice to have some data returned. I'm going to ask it for sample data. Variability is more important than a short script. Give me a combination of 100 first names, 100 last names, use birth dates. Right? I'm basically asking it to give me sample data for the patient's table. You will find that the more descriptive you are here, the better output or maybe the better variability that you will get in data. I specifically said first names and last names. There have been times when I've asked for that and it's just generating a random string. Feel free to be specific. Feel free to refine your prompt. But this went ahead and gave me 1,000 rows in here, and I inserted those. It wasn't set-based. It wasn't the most efficient thing ever. So I could have asked it to do a set-based insert. But now if I query against patients, you can see that I've got 1,000 rows in here. And some of these things are exactly the same, right? The address is the same, the phone number. But for the purposes of our initial development testing, that's okay. Sometimes I just want to make sure I'm getting back data, right? Now, I'm going to go ahead and do this for the rest of the tables. I'm not going to show you all of that because I don't have a ton of time. But trust me, I went and created a bunch of scripts, or asked it to create a bunch of scripts that would fill in all of this data. So the last one that I ran was for the appointments table. So in that black screen there, I completely obviously paused the video, pushed all of that data in. And so now we're going to pick up and we're going to take a look to see a little bit of that data just to validate to you that I have that in place. So I'm going to just say, give me a query to view the top 100 rows for the tables in this database. I'm not going to, I could write that. I can write select top 100 from table. But again, typing that in there and asking it to do that for me, that's not the way that I would have written it, by the way, but that's fine. In this example, it gives me what I need. I can run my select top 100 from all of these tables, and there we go. You can see that I've populated the data in there. Also, real quick before I forget, I'm exporting this. So we have this ability, which I actually love, to export the conversation out to a markdown file. So we're calling it, what am I calling it? General Hospital data or something like that. And it's just a markdown file that you can then basically have as your history of what you did. So you can go back and reuse that as needed. So what I want to do now is I'm going to increase the size of these tables, right? It's great to have data in there. Sometimes you want to have more than just 100 rows or 1,000 rows. We actually want to like increase the size of those by, an order of 10. So I'm asking it for the script to basically duplicate the data within here. And then I'm doing something a little different here where I've said, run that script now, right? I want it to run the script for me. And important to note, it says I'm running in a read-only mode. I can't execute scripts for you, but you can run it in SSMS. Well, in Copilot, we've added a couple different modes. The default is read-only, but we also have one called a read-write, and we also have one which is a read-write with approval. I'm just going to go into read-write. I'm feeling really good about what Copilot is doing for me, and so I'm going to go into read-write mode. Now, it resets the chat history here, so all the conversations that we've had are gone, but I'm going to just bring up this last prompt, which is I need to increase the size of these tables, generate the script for me, right? Duplicate the data. And so it comes back with that. And again, I'm now in a read-write mode, and I'm going to ask it to run those queries on my behalf. And it's just doing an insert. It's a insert and selecting from what's there already. Can I write this? Sure, but it writes it for me. And so I'm going to say, okay, I want you to run the script, but back up the database before you do so. This is me being safe. I'm going to let Copilot run this, and this is just the beginning of my database. So if things get really messed up, I saved out all my scripts to that MD file. I could recreate the database if I needed. But just to show you, you can tell Copilot to back up the database. And so it did. It's like, okay, I've backed it up to see backups, and now I'm going to go ahead and duplicate the data. And it says, I've done that. Great. Trust but verify, because I'm a DBA at heart, really. You don't want me as your developer. But it says, okay, there's your backup. Like I just went and checked. It's there. And again, I asked it to duplicate all of that data. It did that after backing up the database. So I've cleared chat history again. And again, I'm still in the context of my General Hospital database here. And so now we're going to say, okay, give me a query that's going to get the count of the rows in each of the tables. So again, I can write a select count statement. If I only have 5 tables, it probably wouldn't take me that long. But where can you get Copilot to do the work for you? And this is where it's really a shift in your mindset. I know it can be tricky. It's a change in your workflow. And while new improvements are great, like sometimes remembering what you got to do, it can be tricky. So here we go. We inflated the test results, the appointments, and all of that. So now what I'm going to say is, okay, I need you to write some queries. So I re-prompted with some of the original text that I had when I was asking for tables. But now I'm saying, what kind of queries do you need? I might already know that. You might already know what kinds of queries you're going to write. But sometimes it's kind of interesting to ask because maybe there's something you didn't consider. Maybe it writes it a slightly different way. So it comes back with some basic selects. It comes back with some administrative queries, it calls it as well. And then I'm going to say, can you provide a few more complex queries, right? I just don't want one table, but like give me listing the patients for each doctor based on their diagnosis or the number of appointments that a patient had. So now I'm saying, okay, I have an idea of what I want for the queries. Go write them for me. And it comes back with a whole bunch of these, with the 3 that I asked for, actually. Now I'm going to go one step further and say, take that query, and I'm going to actually copy the text of the query, and I want it to put it into a stored procedure where the input is the patient's first and last name. So I grabbed one of the queries that it had written and basically said, put that into a stored procedure where the stored procedure input is patient first name and last name. So it's checking all the T-SQL that has been passed into it, and then it gives me the create procedure script right here. So if we paste this in, you can see that I have first name and last name that it's passing in. And then it has the query, which gets the appointment, the diagnosis for that patient based on input. And I can repeat this. I'm going to go ahead and ask again for a procedure for another query where the input is also not, in this case, let's see, I'm doing doctor information here. So I want physician first and last name. So now in this case, I could have told it to create the stored procedure, but we're doing two things at once here, right? So on the left, I made a slight change to that script because it didn't grab the right varchar length. It grabbed a 50 instead of 100. So I ran that script on the left. Over on the right, Copilot is still doing its thing. It comes back here with this procedure. Oh, sorry, this was get patient test results. So I can go through and do that over and over again, which I did in the background. And so now I've said, okay, I've created these stored procedures. What indexes do I need for those stored procedures? It's great that I've created the queries. I know that I have my clustered index on there. I know that I have some foreign keys, but we just created some other queries that are going to look at first and last name. And so it says, well, there's no missing index recommendations. What do you want me to do? I need to be a little bit more specific here, right? I'm saying use the code in the stored procedures to figure out the indexes for that. Otherwise, it could go and it could look at the workload as it's running right now and identify missing index recommendations. It can also, you can direct it to look through Query Store for that as well. If you've ever had to look for missing index recommendations, it can be kind of a complex query. Copilot can help you write that. Copilot can help you find it. And so now it's coming back with a whole bunch of indexes that it suggests. And I'm going to say, great, go ahead, put all of those into one script. Now, in general, I'll tell you, I don't just willy-nilly go and create lots of indexes without some level of validation. Again, I about said I grew up as a DBA. I spent a lot of time doing performance tuning and database administration. And so there's no magic number of the right indexes. There's a sweet spot of how many indexes do you need that will satisfy all of your queries, but also not interrupt load performance updates, etc. So it recommended an index on patients, a few on appointments, on diagnosis. Now, what I notice when I look at these is that these are all really just single column indexes. Those are probably going to evolve over time, but potentially a good start. Now, I've switched databases here. I may not have noted that, but I'm connected now to the Wide World Importers database because I can run a load against this one. My general hospital I've got all set up, and now I can start running a load. But I already have the scripts to do that for Wide World Importers, so we're going to look at that. And I'm going to say, can you look at performance in this database for the last hour? I've been running a workload for Wide World Importers while we were doing all this other stuff for General Hospital. It says, sure. And it comes back, and I have Query Store enabled, which is one of the best features ever in my opinion, and I know that I'm biased, but that's okay. And it gives me the top resource-consuming queries from Query Store for the last hour. And it's doing that based on average duration. I could ask it to look at CPU. I could ask it to look at I/O, memory. It's defaulting to duration, which is pretty typical. And then I said, have any of those had significant changes in CPU in the last hour? And so it comes back and it says, okay, these have shown a decent change in CPU in the last hour compared to the previous 24 hours. And so then I'm like, well, okay, how can I look at this in a little bit more detail, right? How can I see these specifically in the SSMS UI? And it's great because it tells me, right? It's going to be like, okay, open SSMS, connect to your database, navigate to Query Store, view the performance report, analyze specific queries. So not only is it going to write T-SQL, not only is it going to help me answer questions for me, but it can tell me how to do something within SSMS. So sure enough, I come over here, I look at the top resource consuming queries. I look at this first query here, which has a couple plans, which maybe that's potentially concerning to me. I can slice and dice this data different ways within SSMS. I'm going to change here to look at CPU, and I'm going to look at average CPU because sometimes that's really interesting. And I've got a pretty big change here between the plan 9032 at the bottom and plan 14106 and 14105. And now I'm going to ask Copilot for a little bit of help here. I may or may not be familiar, or you may or not be familiar with how to read an execution plan. So I'm going to ask Copilot to compare the plans for me, right? So I'm giving it the specific plan IDs from Query Store, and I'm saying these are in Query Store, and tell me what is different. Now, reminder, you have to have the Query Store feature enabled for your database to leverage this. It's definitely a huge value add, in my opinion. And I canceled the response because I typed the plan ID incorrectly. And so I'm going to ask it again and say, tell me what is different between these two plans. And it's thinking about it, which is fine. And I can show you here, and I know because this is data that I've worked with for a long time, right? The primary difference between these two plans is that one of them does a clustered index scan, and one of them does an index seek with the key lookup, which feeds into a nested loop. And there are different scenarios where those are necessary. And I can do a compare plan within SSMS right from Query Store, and I can look at those differences. But even though you may be able to identify, oh, this has a nested loop, this has a clustered index scan, sometimes it's still like, what do I do with that information, right? And so Copilot can help you. And it does a little bit of a summary over here on the right side where it summarizes the two different plans, and then it says, here are the key differences, right? One of them uses parallelism, one does not. One has a lower compile, one has a higher, right? Execution plan. Here's the clustered index scan versus the nested loops. And so it says that one plan is optimized for parallel execution. The other is for simpler non-parallel, and it's actually for smaller data that's going to be returned. And so I'm like, okay, what is the main data set that these access when they're looking at the clustered index scan versus the key lookup? I can dig into that in the properties, but I can also just ask Copilot. And it says, well, for the clustered index seek, it goes against customer transaction. It goes against that for the key lookup as well. And so they access the same table and indexes, but one is doing a seek and one is doing a scan. Right? So it's explaining all of this. Again, you can save this out, right? If this is the kind of thing where you look at it and you're like, I kind of understand, but maybe I want to come back to it later, save the chat out as an MD file. The last thing I'm going to ask it here is I'm going to say, is there any way to improve performance of this query based on the plans, right? So is there anything in the plans that can help you figure out how to make this better? And it's, again, entire chat history here is relevant. And it's like, okay, here are my recommendations. Both plans have a missing index recommendation, which is definitely something to pay attention to. It talks about some other things I could do. I can look at the parallelism for the plan. It mentions down below updating statistics. The order that they're in, don't always assume priority unless you asked for a priority order. But the clustered index, the non-clustered index recommendation, because it appears in both plans, is worth investigating a little bit further. And it gives me the steps to either create the index, to update statistics, to potentially look at using a query hint. This is another one. This is an interesting scenario where maybe I understand a fair bit about indexes, but I haven't done a ton with query hints. And so I'm going to say, what are the drawbacks of using this query hint of option recompile? And it's going to go through and it's going to list out for me the potential drawbacks of using this. Increase CPU, increase compile time. You end up not having that plan stored in cache because it has to recompile every single time you execute it. If that's a query that you execute a ton, that's probably not something you want to do. That's why it drives CPU. And so it gives some examples of when you want to use it, when you have a parameter sensitivity issue, which is what's happening here, for variable data, etc. And I love this conclusion that it gives, right? It can be useful, but it's generally better to address the root cause. And in this case, I can tell you that the non-clustered index is really how to address the root cause. A few slides to wrap up with here. Thanks for, I know that those demos were really, really quick, but hopefully you found a ton of value and they've really piqued your interest in what you can do with Copilot in SSMS. Coming to a theater near you. In all seriousness, let's talk about the roadmap for a second. It will be available at some point in the future, and it will be available with SSMS 21 as an optional workload, which means it's not installed by default. The bits don't go on your machine by default. You control whether you have it installed or not. As I said several times during the demo, we will be bringing that inline editor to SSMS. I don't have a timeline on that, but the team's actively working on that. And then you'll be able to do fix doc explain from right within the editor. A few questions that we frequently get asked, which I've thrown up here onto an FAQ slide. The first one, when will it be publicly available? Spoiler, I don't have a date. It depends. We're very much focused on quality over a specific date that it will be available. And I'm sure a lot of you can appreciate that. In terms of cost, I mentioned before, that's really dependent upon the deployment, the endpoint, and the model and the use. The offerings that we support right now, Azure SQL Database, Azure SQL Managed Instance, and then SQL Server, we will support 2025 and earlier, probably back to what is currently supported for SQL Server, which I think is 2014. And in terms of enabling, disabling, again, I want to make this very clear. This is a workload that is optional when you install SSMS 21. So it's not part of SSMS by default. You opt in. If you don't want it, you uninstall it, you remove that workload. And then in terms of Copilots for other offerings, Copilot for Azure SQL is out there, and we know that there's some other offerings available. Stay tuned for more updates on that. A few tips when you're using Copilot in SSMS. The context matters, so make sure you're in the database that you're interested in or connected to that database. How quickly it's going to respond really depends on what you've asked it to do. Sometimes when you're asking for a summary, that can take longer than if you're just saying, hey, what's the compat mode for my database? Use it when you need help. Anytime you might typically hop over to your favorite search engine to ask a question, ask Copilot first. It's a change in your workflow, but I promise you that if you can stick with it, it will reduce the amount of time you have to spend on certain tasks and definitely on mundane tasks. And then one thing I don't have on here is don't treat the sidecar chat like the editor, like the results grid, right? You really want to ask typically for a query and then run the query versus asking Copilot to give you all of that information. I think that when folks start writing T-SQL within the editor, when we have that capability available, that will be a much more natural fit. Thanks for tuning in, for attending this conference. I really appreciate it, and catch you next time.